This is the basic structure of a Ponzi scheme, and this is the formula that makes it or breaks it. People who get in first put in some of their money expecting to get some money back, but it's not their money that they get back or the interest that money generates, it's really the money from others, from newcomers to the pyramid. In other words, the money that you inject into the system is really just used to feed people higher in the pyramid. Now, does that sound familiar?
Am I going to get Social Security? Am I lucky enough to have a pension? Do I have rental income?
Is this the retirement that you imagined?
No.
Only 36% of Americans feel that their retirement planning is actually on track.
Ponzi schemes fall apart when they run out of people to put into the system. And the pension system most countries used is based on that exact same premise. For years, we've lived with actual population pyramids. More people are born, more people join the workforce, more people feed the system, supporting those at the top that earned their retirement. And just like in a Ponzi scheme, there's a formula that breaks this system. A formula that breaks when birth rates decrease, or that might break if workforces are replaced by robots or AI. So today, I'm diving deep into the formulas that feed these pyramids, what drives them, what broke them, and discovering the only hope our generation has to be able to retire. If you want to start pointing fingers, the first dude that fucked up is this guy. That's German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, though I'm pretty sure he had no idea why. His system, created in 1889, stipulated that people over the age of 70 who are retired should be cared for by the government, which wasn't the most popular idea. He even got called a socialist for it. But let's explore his logic. Consider an elderly population of P times their benefits, which are a percentage of the salary that they made while they worked. In this day and age, that's about 40%. Now that's a lot of money that we just can't pull out of thin air. So how do we pay for it? Well, we have all these active workers. We can take a percentage of their wage to fund the system. Now, if you don't want to do too much math, here's the same diagram with a more visual approach. Workers, retirees, and the percentage of their wages. Now, in Otto's time, this is how Germany's population pyramid actually looked. Children could work starting at 13, and the retirement age was set at 70. So you'd have this massive workforce funding this small population of retirees. Now, in Bismarck's original system, the balance was such that you had more funds coming into the pension system than the system or the elderly required, which even allowed social security systems to create these capital reserves, these funds. In Germany, though, that extra surplus got scratched and reverted to a balance where the contributions more or less matched the benefits. And this is called a pure pay-as-you-go system. So, cool. What could go wrong with that?
The great powers had built global empires and armies larger and more powerful than any in history. The First World War lasted 4 years and claimed the lives of some 10 million soldiers.
Germany, Japan, and Italy renew their military alliance. The Axis powers are ready to carve up the world.
Now, Germany's population pyramid is really interesting because you can start to see these dents. Turns out the population tends to shrink if you send them to die in the war. But this part down here is not a war. It isn't even a dent. As a matter of fact, this isn't even a pyramid anymore. It's more like a tree. Now, dear Otto would have never in his wildest dreams imagined that his math would break like this. Because we're always gonna get more humans, right?
We are getting 3 people each. The more people that get involved, the more people who are investing, the more money we're all gonna make. It's not even a scheme per se, it's...
Speaking of which, have you realized how hard it is to reach a human audience online in this day and age? Well, our sponsor for today's video, Ghost, is an open source platform that brings your audiences together. The thing is, creators today have ended up with these silos of YouTube subscribers or Instagram followers, but they're all separate, and you often depend on someone else's algorithm to reach them, an algorithm that you can't control and that changes all the time. Ghost lets you create your own platform, one around your brand, your design, and your domain. Ghost is actually a non-profit foundation, and their platform is open source, which means that no matter what happens with them, you own your code and your website can live on. Ghost is on a mission to give creators like me and journalists the keys to publishing for the future of online media. We partnered with them, and they've given you guys a 10% discount on their first Ghost payment, which you can maximize by subscribing to their annual plan. You also help our channel in the process. Link is going to be in the description, or you can just snatch this QR code here. Thanks, Ghost, for helping creators like us and for supporting today's video. Now, this is the current population pyramid for Germany. It doesn't look too different from other developed countries. Here's France's, here's the UK, here's the US. Now, we keep calling these things population pyramids, but they haven't really been pyramids for a while. Who is going to pay for these pensions if we have more and more retirees and fewer workers? The number of retired people above this line is mostly affected by two numbers: the retirement age, i.e. the height of this line, and the life expectancy. Now, junk food might be killing us all, but let's face it, unless we actually go to World War III, the average human age is gonna keep growing. Humans are just gonna keep living longer, which is great for your grandma, but terrible for our pension equation. That leaves only the other number to play around with, but people don't seem to like that.
Thousands of people taking to the streets there on plan to raise the retirement age.
From retiring at 62 to age 64.
The entire pension system could be at risk.
At riot police struggled to contain protesters, some of whom set fires in the streets.
Now, before we join a riot, let's look at the math behind it. The reason retirement age and life expectancy strain the system is because of a number called the dependency rate. Now, if we rearrange our scale into an actual math equation, we can get to this ratio. That's the dependency rate. That's the number of retirees, people that the system supports, divided by the number of workers in the system. For example, if we have 5 pensioners for every 100 workers, and they receive a 40% of a wage as a benefit, then each worker would need to contribute about 2% to the system. That's not too crazy. This is a 5% dependency ratio. 20 workers to support 1 retiree. A balanced equation, not a big strain on the workers. Now, if instead of 5, we had 10 retirees, 10 pensioners per 100 workers, because these seniors are now living longer, the system loses balance. We have a new dependency ratio, in this case, 10%. So if we want to keep the same benefits, the only way to balance this out is to increase the contribution rate, in this case, to 4%. Now, a 10% old age dependency rate is honestly not too crazy. America's dependency rate was 12% in the 50s, but times have changed. As of 2023, the dependency rate in the US is 26%. It's over 35% in most of Europe, and it's 50% in Japan. That means that in Japan, each pensioner is supported by the income of only 2 workers. If this was funded entirely on a pay-as-you-go system, that would require a 20% contribution rate to maintain a 40% benefit, which honestly leaves very little money for ramen. It's also not just about how much employees pay, it's about how much of the country's wealth goes to supporting the retired population. Public pension expenses now exceed 9% of the GDP across the OECD, with Italy topping 15% of their GDP going to maintaining their elderly population. It's more than they spend on schools, roads, and R&D combined. In the US, the Old Age and Survivors Pension Fund actually operated with surpluses all through 2019. And just like with the OG German system, that allowed the US to create a pension fund, savings. But that balance finally broke in 2020, which means that previous savings now need to be used to keep the Social Security benefits the same. The trustees project that the US Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust will hit 0 in 2033, which will force an automatic 23% benefit haircut unless some new legislation gets created. There's simply no money from productive workers, from active workers today, to sustain the pensioned ones at the current rates. Now, trust me, I've done this math, and all of this feels quite hopeless, to be honest, kind of like we're on our own, and like we got a very short end of this stick. Now, if that weren't enough of a ticking bomb, we haven't looked at the lower side of that equation and the shrinking number of workers. Population pyramids aren't pyramids anymore because people are not having enough kids to maintain the population. If you need 2 people to make 1 baby, the fertility rate needed to maintain the population is 2.1. That means that on average, each woman needs to have 2 children with the occasional third to offset childhood mortality. Now, mind you, that metric would allow a country to maintain a population, not to grow it like in the old pyramid days. However, in the US, the fertility rate is now down to 1.6 as of 2025, which Doesn't sound too crazy. It's actually on par with the rest of the developed world. But let me show you what that math means. Let's assume that the fertility rate stays at 1.6 where it is, even though in practice it's actually been decreasing every year. If you have a generation of 3.6 million children, the actual births for 2024, in 25 years or so, the US is gonna have only about 2.8 million births. In another generation, so another 25 years or so, that's gonna drop to 2.2 million births. Now, that same mid-century period will see about 4 million deaths as we millennials age out and kick the bucket. So we're doing 4 million deaths, but only 2.2 million births. According to the US Census Bureau, there will be 370 million Americans in 2080, and that will be the max number of living Americans ever. After that, it's gonna be a population decline. And this connects back to that dependency rate. PEW research projects that in an intermediate scenario for the US, there will be 2.1 workers sustaining one retiree by the end of the century. In other words, a dependency rate of 47%. And that's not even the worst example. In most of Europe, fertility rates have already dropped below 1.5. It's 1.2 in Spain. Most forecasts say that by 2050, Spain will have roughly 62 retirees for every 100 workers. That's 1.6 workers supporting each elder, or a 62% dependency rate. The worst fertility rate in a country is in South Korea. That is now at 0.75. That means that there's less than one child per couple on average. Kuzgesagt has a fantastic video about this if you want to watch. Humans are gonna cap at around 10 billion people, and there's not a lot that we can do about it. Africa is on track to surpass Asia as the most populated continent, and the slice for the rest of us is only gonna get slimmer. But pension systems were designed around population pyramids, around this Ponzi scheme of a growing human population, and that's just not the reality anymore. Let's go to the next variable in this equation, which is productivity. I mentioned that the average OECD country spends 9% of their GDP in pensions. GDP, that's gross domestic product, it's directly impacted by the number of workers that the country has producing goods and services. So if a country has fewer workers, its GDP is gonna be reduced, unless you had more productive workers. And that has actually been the case for a century. The average US worker today has an output of about $115 in productivity per hour. That's called labor productivity. And through history, every new tech advancement has made people more productive. Again, in terms of US dollar value generated per hour of work. So, what about AI? Is it like computers in the 90s or assembly lines in the 20th century? According to a McKinsey paper, AI could bring as much as 0.6% extra productivity growth per year. And I genuinely believe that is really just scratching the surface. Some other studies I've read put that number at over 1.5%. But people who fear artificial intelligence always think of employment as the big concern, but they rarely consider the fact that if countries want to keep their GDPs growing, they're gonna need more new workers than they are currently producing. AI looks like a compelling answer to that predicament, but not without its dangers. And the most obvious one is, well, what if we replace too many workers to the point where we trigger an unemployment crisis? I'm honestly less worried about this path, because every time new tech comes to the world, jobs get replaced, but new jobs get created. And those transitions have always been painful for the workers in those industries, but time and time again, they have found new jobs. What does concern me is that the main beneficiary of that extra AI productivity is not the workers, but the investors. And investors are not gonna pay for my pension. Now, AI is helping white-collar workers perform the work of 3 to 4 people, but if their salary doesn't change, then that work isn't trickling down into a social security system. Sure, bigger GDP to brag with, some extra tax revenue for the government, but unless the benefits of extra productivity trickle down to the workers, there is no system in place today so that those benefits end up in our pension. So, what can we do? What solutions do we have? There are 3 directions we could go. And I'm gonna write this one off first. I'm a parent, it's a lot of work, it's expensive. It'd be a lot easier with that 1-year paternity leave that you seem to get in all these European countries. Would you have more kids if you had that? Well, my buddy Wouter, who lives in Sweden, got a 1-year paternity leave, free daycare, childcare, tax breaks when he had his kids, and despite all of these benefits, Sweden still has a natality rate of just 1.5. For countries like Norway, France, or Hungary, introducing these parental benefits worked to give natality rates or fertility rates a small spike, but those flattened out very quickly, or just kept falling like before. So I don't think the answer is there. One of the most important factors in fertility rates is education for women. There is a direct correlation between the mean school years and the fertility rate. More educated women want fewer kids. And actually that's fine by me. We just can't rely on forcing people to have more kids so that we can retire. Migration gets thrown here as well, because without migration, the population of the US would be in an even faster freefall. Canada had some ideas, gave this a try, but there are immediate challenges to immigration, and most people can't see past those, despite the potential to alleviate the ticking bomb of pensions. Now, some models have even proposed tying pension benefits to natality rates. In other words, your pension increases if you multiply, which makes logical sense, but it's still only theoretical. Okay, so let's go to the next option. Maybe make people work longer. As shitty as working through your 70th birthday might sound, we need to deal with the reality that we are living longer and we are being productive for a smaller percentage of our lives. Retiring at 60 with a life expectancy of 70 looks like this in the percentage of your life where you're productive. But retiring at 62 with a life expectancy of 85 doesn't balance it out. It is just what it is. Now, that being said, there is a lot of room for improvement in how governments are handling this. A paper by the OECD found that in European countries, France, Spain, Greece, for example, the normal retirement age and the minimum retirement age are, say, 2 to 5 years apart. This means that some people choose to retire as soon as they can, even though they're penalized with fewer benefits. Pushing the normal retirement age by, say, 1 year. Maybe they change the law so that you're penalized if you retire before this age. That age gets pushed a little bit. That only really creates an impact in practice of about 3 months, because that's how long workers in practice stay employed, even if the law changes. It's much more powerful to change the minimum retirement age, which makes workers stay on average for 9 extra months. In other words, changing the early exit loopholes seems to be key, and that might create less pushback than adjusting that normal retirement age. Now, whether you agree with that or not, there is still a limit to that flexibility, because how much can the retirement age go? People over 70 should probably not be around heavy machinery or, making life and death decisions, but it is quite inevitable. Denmark recently made the painful but necessary changes to their laws and set the current retirement age at 70, one of the highest in Europe. But Denmark's model has ultimately been successful, regarded as one of the best in the world, mostly thanks to their solid 3-pillar system. For most countries around the world, these pay-as-you-go systems, the Ponzi scheme type of social security, that's the core of the pension system. And they represent what's called the first pillar, which is again funded by others below you on the population pyramid. Not to be confused with the 0 pillar, which are usually government funds used to support elders who are in poverty. Then you have the second pillar. The second pillar is funded by the retiree, by the pensioner, while they're working, of course, and also by their employer. And the difference is that this is money that goes directly to the retiree's private account, not to a pool of money. Now, Pillar 2 funds are mandatory, which means that every employee and their employer must fund them while they're working. And then the last, third pillar, is voluntary contributions to a pension fund. For you Americans, that'd be your 401ks, which is optional for both the employee and the employer. Denmark relies on all 3 of them. In the US, there is no second pillar. Most pensioners' income comes from a mix of Social Security, complemented by their 401ks and the occasional employer pension. In the US, for a middle-class senior, Social Security will be just under half of their income. In the EU, while it varies a lot per country, most countries will have about 70% of the pensioner's income coming from that first pillar. And then a shift to these private/mandatory pension funds is a way for workers to even out the likely shrinking Social Security checks. Now, Chile experimented with a less socialist approach starting in 1981 when they privatized pensions, making your contributions actually yours. In other words, scratching Pillar 1 completely and betting it all on Pillar 2, mandatory contributions to a personal individual account. But the system didn't work. After riots and hard-fought victory, a new law was passed earlier this year to bring back Pillar 1 to complement Pillar 2. Diversified pension plans are really an underrated solution to this problem, and there are ongoing studies and pilot programs to bring more pillars into the mix, like portable benefits like the Black Car Fund in New York, or government-guaranteed retirement accounts. Now let's talk about the last point. a much more exciting alternative. So Japan is a really good intro to this third alternative. Japan is a country that sees AI and robotics as vital tools to maintain its economic output despite the shrinking number of workers. Because convenience stores have cashierless kiosks, bullet train food carts are restocked by autonomous porters, and cherry tomato farms now harvest with AI-guided mechanical pickers. They've embraced AI. Japan runs on 419 industrial robots for every 10,000 manufacturing workers, about 2.5 the global average. And this solves the employment problem, the GDP problem, and it alleviates the pension problem. Japan is using tax revenue, i.e. part of their GDP, to fund the pension system. In other words, there is a pillar zero in Japan, funded by the country's prosperity. Korea has an even higher world-leading density of over 1,000 robots per 10,000 workers. Now, South Korea gets some credit for introducing this robot tax, which is really just a cut of subsidies for companies that use robots or AI. For countries with these critically shrinking populations, that robot tax, works, but it could backfire, because it could end up impacting their GDP. But the concept isn't too crazy. In the end, what we need to do under this third solution is convert the extra productivity into dollars that end up in the pockets of those who need them. In the US, as the extreme opposite example, the benefits of automation are not trickling down to anybody except for the investors. AI in the US isn't after your job, it's mostly after your raise, but more on that in a second. I firmly believe that AI is gonna make this blue line exponential. That's the productivity per human worker. And this represents quite a unique opportunity to use that extra revenue, that extra GDP, to fill in these gaps. And this is not your typical tax the rich argument, although certainly we should tax the rich. But more crucially, AI dividends could be the key to making sure that this balance doesn't break even further and to keep the balance on an aging population. Because picture this, what if we treat AI like black gold, like oil? When Norway tapped into the North Sea for oil, they stuffed that cash into a sovereign wealth fund that still cuts checks to every citizen every year. Alaska did something similar. Alaska mails every resident about $1,700 a year, no strings attached. Researchers at the Oxford Future of Humanity Institute proposed this windfall clause in 2020, which is a voluntary contract that would activate when an AI-based company earns truly extraordinary profits. For example, say a company's profits exceed 0.1% of global GDP, this firm would commit to contributing part of those earnings, part of that profit, not as a punitive tax, but as a contribution to the rest of us. To see the scale, imagine this AI company that nets, $5 trillion in profit in 2060, say 1.8% of the projected global output, and then under that schedule, that company would transfer about $400 billion in that year alone and help alleviate all these problems. I, for once, wouldn't set the bar so high, but if we're replacing humans for robots, not just for profits, but because we aren't getting enough humans, then transferring profits to them, to us, the humans, seems like a perfectly reasonable win for both. Now, fewer humans isn't a bad deal, in my opinion. But I don't think that anybody is seriously stopping to think that we no longer live in pyramids. And just as society was kind of restructured naturally, we need to think of a new structure to deal with this reality. Now, for the other line on that chart I showed you, that blue line, our salaries today, we made an entire video about that last month, so check it out. We'll see you in the next one.